Good evening to you. If you've got your Bible tonight, I invite you to open up in your Old Testaments to Genesis chapter 30. That's where we'll start here in just a moment. Genesis chapter 30. Got visitors in our audience once again. We are truly, truly thankful that you are here with us. And if you're able to hang around a little while after services so that we can meet you and get to know you a little bit better, we certainly would appreciate that. Got some of our folks who are making it back into town. We're thankful for that. Others who are out traveling and returning to us, we want to be prayerful for them as they are headed back this way. We have some friends. I think many of you have met our friends sitting right in front of us. That's Sam and Becca Starnes and their girls, Emma Jane and Mia and Addie Grace. They are friends from Longview. Sam's a deacon at the church there at Judson Road where I preached before coming here. And then our families individually go back before all three of us were born. All of our parents knew each other. So it's always special to have our friends here. And I know several of you have gotten to meet them and appreciate them. It's good they'll be leaving tomorrow, but it's been good to have them here in town as well. Do you ever read some of these Old Testament stories and have trouble relating to the characters? Daniel sounds like a pretty awesome guy, doesn't he? But how well do you relate to Daniel on a fundamental way in your life? Not too many of us have been threatened with death. Not too many of us have been plucked up from our homelands and separated from our parents and put into some form of indentured bondage for years. Not many of us have been threatened with being thrown into a den of lions or being simply threatened with death because of our faith, because of our refusal not to pray. There are other Old Testament characters. Maybe we can relate to Moses sometimes, but sometimes even Moses is hard to relate to. There's one I've always had trouble relating to. Maybe you have, or maybe I'm just odd. Don't answer that, Nancy Carter. Genesis 37. If you're peeking ahead in your Bible and you're looking at chapter 37, you see the topic. It's a story of a young man by the name of Joseph. I think sometimes, general statement here, I think sometimes we paint a rather angelic picture of Joseph. And I think perhaps that's not entirely accurate. And that may be a hurdle for some of us in being able to grasp what's going on in this story and take from it some practical lessons for our lives. I want us, for a few moments tonight, to talk about perhaps some thoughts that were going through Joseph's head, but certainly some lessons that you and I can learn as we kind of jump down in this pit with Joseph and sit there with him for a little while. But in order to get to chapter 37 and verses 21 through 24, we got to do a little bit of background work. So come back with me to chapter 30, Genesis chapter 30, and let's set the stage for Joseph. And if you remember anything about Joseph, you probably remember the coat of many colors, right? Joseph's father loved him more than his 11 other brothers, and decided to give him, singularly, a coat of many colors to the exclusion of all of the rest of the sons and presumably the daughter as well. Joseph's story reaches back to Genesis chapter 30, where Joseph is born to his parents, Jacob and Rachel. Genesis chapter 30, and in verse 24, or verse 22 rather, God remembered Rachel, and God gave heed to her and opened her womb, and so she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she named him Joseph, saying, may the Lord give me another son. So here's Joseph, born to his parents, Jacob and Rachel. Jacob, we recognize that name perhaps from our Old Testaments. Jacob was the brother of Esau. You remember this story? Jacob and Esau fighting within their mother's womb? These two, Jacob and Esau, were the sons of Isaac and his wife, Rebekah. And if you remember about Isaac, of course, is going to be the son of Abraham and Sarah. Jacob, who is the father of Joseph, meets his future wife, Rachel, in Genesis chapter 29. Do you remember this story? And he has to work for 7 years, and if he works for 7 years, he is going to earn the hand of Rachel in marriage. He works the 7 years, he goes to marry his bride, they are committed to one another, he lifts the veil only to find what? Can you imagine the shock at your wedding day of lifting your bride's veil, and lo and behold, it's her ugly sister whose name literally means cow. That is not a joke. Her name means cow. Take that for whatever it means to you. And the dad really plays it off and says, well, sorry, didn't do anything wrong. Culture dictates my firstborn daughter gets married first. But I'll make you the deal of a lifetime. Are you ready for this? If you work 7 more years for me, I'll give you Rachel. Some of the women in here just shook their head and said, no, you just cut your losses and go on. I'm glad you said that. I would kind of have to agree, I think. Right? 7 years working, not getting the woman you were promised, says something about the family, doesn't it? Says something about the father. But Jacob persists. He loves Rachel, doesn't he? Works the 7 years. This will be his bride. And off they go. There is going to be trouble, as there is in any marriage. And there's going to be trouble even within the family of Isaac as it relates to Jacob and Esau. Do you remember the story earlier where Jacob steals his brother's birthright blessing? Remember that? Isaac wants to bless Esau as Isaac is getting older. Rebekah hears about this and she devises the plan where they take Jacob and they put animal skins on his arm to make him the hairy man, right? This was always the fun day in Bible class because the teacher gave you hairy stuff to put on your arms. You got to pretend that you were Esau, right? And Jacob steals the blessing. I want you to look at the blessing, the specific birthright blessing that was to be given to Esau that Jacob stole. Look at chapter 27 in Genesis. Genesis capítulo 27, verso 27. Genesis 27 and verse 27. The blessing that Isaac would give what he thought was his firstborn, but was indeed Jacob. When Jacob came near to his father Isaac, Isaac smelled him and the smell of his garments, and he blessed him and said, see, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field which the Lord has blessed. Now may God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and an abundance of grain and new wine. Now notice this, verse 29. May peoples serve you. May nations bow down to you. Do you remember something in the story of Joseph about bowing down? Be master of your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. When we skip ahead, and we'll skip forward later to the story of Genesis 37, that begins to ring very true. And no doubt this would be clicking in Jacob's mind, hearing this about his son, Joseph. Anyone who says the Bible is boring doesn't give it a good read. Because in the meantime, Rachel is going to die after she gives birth to Joseph's younger brother, Benjamin. And what follows is trouble with Reuben, who is Joseph's oldest brother, Jacob's oldest son. Reuben is going to have a sexual relationship with one, not the only, but one of his father's concubines, Bilhah, who just happens to be the mother of his brothers, Dan and Naphtali. Maybe we could get out a chart and plot this out for you, but you're beginning to see modern television shows about who's the dad and things like that got nothing on the book of Genesis. They have trouble in the book of Genesis just like you and I encounter it, maybe in our homes, in our families, certainly in our culture and in our society today. There is nothing new under the sun. All of this turmoil and heartache and family upside downness then brings us to Genesis chapter 37. Isaac has died. Here is Jacob raising his family, now without, it seems, his beloved wife, Rachel. She died giving birth to Benjamin. But Joseph still has the hope of his firstborn son to Rachel, Joseph. And as we come over here to Genesis chapter 37, and in verse 2, these are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, when he was 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah, those would be Dan and Naphtali, the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought back a bad report about his brothers to their father. There's a whole lot that's going to happen here in Genesis chapter 37. You skip down to verses 3 and 4, and we're given a little bit of information at this point that we don't have earlier. Joseph is the recipient of overt favoritism by his father. This is not hidden. This is out in the open. Literally everybody sees it. Imagine on the bleak landscape of the promised land, of the land of Canaan. No doubt dusty, a lot of tan colorage in the background, pock marks maybe of green here and there, but mostly we're seeing tan. And then out in the horizon, you see the golden child. Here comes Joseph. And how do you see it's Joseph? He stands out blazing in the background, doesn't he? He's got this coat of many colors. He was favored by his father for a few reasons. He is the son of his old age, verse 3 tells us. There's also the son of his old age, meaning that Joseph is going to be the next to last child of Jacob, the last being Benjamin. He is not only the son of his old age, he is the firstborn son of Rachel, who was the woman that Jacob loved the most. And then perhaps we have this. He seems to be Dad's spy, or at least the one that Dad always gets to give the report. The end of verse 2. Joseph brought back a bad report about his brothers to their father. And so he made him, verse 3, a very colored tunic, a multicolored tunic. His brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers. And so they hated him, and they could not speak to him on friendly terms. I want you to focus in on this statement with me for just a few moments here in verse 2. Joseph brought back a bad report about them to his fathers. I think, if you would engage me for just a moment, I think this might be a passage that helps us humanize Joseph a little bit. That phrase, their bad report, is a unique phrase in the Old Testament. It's unique because this phrase is never, ever used in a positive sense in the entire Old Testament. This phrase, bad report, and the corresponding original Hebrew terminology there. I want you to look at two passages with me. The first one is the book of Numbers. Go forward 30, 40 pages maybe to the book of Numbers, Numbers chapter 13. Números 13, verso 32. Numbers 13 and verse 32. In Numbers chapter 13, you have the account of Israelites going out and spying the land of Canaan that is eventually going to be theirs. And in chapter 13 and in verse 32, as the spies are coming back, they gave a report out to the sons of Israel. They gave, verse 32, a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land throughout which we have gone in spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great size. There we also saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim. and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. A couple of different times Israel is going to spy out the land of Canaan. You remember Joshua and Caleb are going to be the two spies that bring back a good report. All the other spies bring back this bad report. And in that this is a bad report here, it's a faithless report. You see the same thing repeated in Numbers 14, verses 36 and 37. It is describing here faithlessness. That's what bad report means here. It's not just a factual telling of things. And that seems to be then the indication here in Genesis 37 that when Joseph brings back this report to his father, it's not simply a statement of fact. He's not simply relating to his father everything that is going on. It seems to be tinged, as we would expect a 17-year-old to kind of color events, if he's trying to get back at his brothers who have said outright they hate him and cannot speak nicely towards him. He's a 17-year-old. That's not surprising, is it? It would be more surprising if he was this angelic character at 17. There is also the reality that this phrase, bad report, is used in the sense of slander in the Old Testament. Look at Psalm 31 and verse 13. Psalm 31 and verse 13. Salmos capítulo 31, verso 13. Psalm 31 and verse 13. For I have heard the slander of many. Terror is on every side. While they took counsel together against me, they schemed to take my life away. The slander of many is the same Hebrew translation of bad report back in Genesis 37 and bad report back in Numbers 13 and bad report back in Numbers 14. I say all that simply to introduce this to us. I don't think the biblical presentation here is of Joseph being just this kind of cherub-like 17-year-old who is scot-free and completely innocent in all of his life up to this point. Is Joseph a prophet? Yes. Is God communicating, as we come back to Genesis 37, is God communicating to Joseph in his dreams? Absolutely. Is God using Joseph for a greater purpose? Yes. But I think that should then be the comfort to us, that God can take us even where we are, and if we'll simply submit ourselves to Him, He can use us in greater service and refine us into better people. And quite frankly, that's exactly what Joseph needed. He needed to be refined. He has these dreams, doesn't he? In chapter 37, the first dream he has down here in verse 6, he tells his brothers, I had this dream. We were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf rose up and stood erect, and behold, your sheaves, your bundles of wheat gathered around and bowed down to my bundle of wheat. And his brother said to him, are you actually going to reign over us? Are you really going to rule over us? And so they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. And in verse 9, he had yet another dream. And this time he tells it not only to his brothers, but also to his father. And he says in verse 9, in this dream, the sun and the moon and 11 stars. He's not hiding this, is he? The sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Now, remember back when we read that birthright blessing that Isaac gave to Jacob in Genesis chapter 27? May nations bow down to you. May you rule over your brothers and your mother's sons. That was the blessing that was given to Jacob, but now Jacob is hearing his son tell this dream that's come to him from God. What do you think's going on in Jacob's head? I think he's starting to put pieces together and connect the dots. He almost assuredly is. The text tells us in verse 11, his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. Why? Because he remembered what his father had said to him. God's promise is coming true. But that's not going to be a great comfort for Joseph in the moment. Because what's going to happen? Following the dreams, he's going to be sent back out in verse 14 to go check on his brothers again. He is walking over to check on where his brothers have gone. And in verse 18, they see him from a distance. Why? Multicolored coat, perhaps? And before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, verse 19, here comes this dreamer. Now then, come and let us kill him, throw him into the pit. We'll tell Dad one of the wild beasts got him. Sorry, Dad. Reuben hears this in verse 21, says, no, that's not what we're going to do. Let's just throw him in a pit and leave him. And Reuben has the great idea of what? I'm going to come back. I'm going to lift him out of the pit. I'm going to take him home to Dad and say, Dad, your baby boy that you love so much, or wink, wink, nudge, nudge, the baby boy that has overtaken me in the role of the firstborn, the one that you really, really love, Dad, I saved him for you. So how about putting me back where I belong? Right? There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of moral concern on the part of Reuben here so much as working his way back into his father's graces. And of course, we know the story doesn't go that way. As Reuben walks off to tend to the flocks, the brothers decide, no, we're not just going to leave him in the pit. Here comes some slave traders. Let's sell our brother to the slave traders. And by the way, we come up with this plan as you look here in Genesis 37. We come up with this plan about selling him to the slave traders in verse 25 while Joseph is where? In the pit. And in verse 25, what are we brothers doing? Oh, we're having a picnic. Have you caught that before? Verse 25, they throw him in the pit and they sit down and have a meal. Can you imagine just the abject cruelty of this entire picture? There's a little bit more. I want you to get a good picture about this. Our Spanish translation of the Bible is not going to call this a pit, I think, Brother Maldonado. It's the Spanish word for well, isn't it? That they throw him into a dried out well. And I think that's probably the accurate translation here. Most of our translations are going to say pit. Most Spanish Bibles are going to say well. And I think that's the idea, because the note here in verse 24 that Jonathan read for us was they throw him into the pit, and the pit did not have what? Did not have water in it. Well, it's a dried out well, isn't it? That seems to be the picture here. Think about wells with me just a little bit. This is what Joseph is most likely thrown into, a dried out well. When you're talking about wells, they can vary greatly in depth depending on how much water you need or anything like that. Sometimes if you're really, really lucky, you can get away with a well and get a water supply going just as shallow as 10 feet down. When you're talking about Jacob's well that we read about in the Bible, if archaeologists have correctly identified that, and there's some question about it, but if they have correctly identified it, it's noted for being somewhere in the range of 100 to 200 feet down. And this wouldn't have been some sort of archaeological feat that was beyond the capacity of Old Testament peoples. When you talk about the Ogallala Aquifer here in the U.S. that runs underneath some of the central states, you can tap down into that going down somewhere around 500 feet. So you're talking wells can vary greatly in size. But this well has dried out. Can you imagine what that would have been like? You ever been in an elevator when the elevator breaks down? That is not a very comforting feeling, is it? Or have you ever been on a Ferris wheel when the Ferris wheel stops? Or have you been on a roller coaster when one of the emergency blocks steps in? And you're just there and you're not going anywhere. And all you've got to do besides baking in the hot San Antonio sun is to think about your own life choices that brought you into the current position that you're in. What's going on with Joseph in this pit? Could I submit to you before we get to our applications one other thing that's happening here? Look at verse 24. You ever tried to make a 17-year-old boy do anything? That's not an easy task, is it? You ever tried to make your 17-year-old brother do anything? you're even less likely to accomplish something there. So how do you get your 17-year-old brother into the bottom of a dried out well? Verse 24 tells us, right? You throw him into it. You don't let him down. I mean, does anyone here have a picture like we're doing? Is it Isaiah later in the Old Testament or Jeremiah where we wrap the cloths under his arm and we're going to lower him down and raise him back up very gently? Does anybody get that picture here? How are you getting Joseph down in this well? We're heave-hoeing and throwing him in, right? And if this well reflects some of the wells that we see in the area, you're going down 10 feet at least. Right? Think about how deep modern swimming pools are, 8 feet, 9 feet, and you're just jumping into water there. You're thrown down 10 feet, you're thrown down 20 feet. If you land on your feet, what's happening to your ankles? What's happening to your bones in your feet? And that's if you're lucky enough to be able to control your descent. What if you land on your back? What if you try to brace your fall like his natural instinct? There goes your wrist. There goes your hand. And I say all that to kind of put this into an understandable picture for us. As we try to humanize Joseph here for a minute, sometimes we read this story and we think, well, if I was 17 years old, I'd just crawl out of the pit. If you're talking about a dried out well, number one, that's narrow, you're thinking you're going to crab walk out of there, right? How are you going to do that with broken feet, broken wrists, and broken ribs? And the answer is what? You're not. You're in a crumpled mess, hurting and broken, lying at the bottom of a pit, while your brothers throw a feast and talk about whether they are going to kill you, actively kill you, whether they're going to leave you there in the pit, or you catch them talking about their newest plan, which is they are going to sell you into human slavery. Now we've humanized Joseph. Now we see the struggle. And now we get to talk about 4 simple lessons I think we can draw out from here. And number 1 is this. Sometimes we suffer because of our own poor decisions. And sometimes we suffer because of the poor decisions of others. There are a couple of people at fault here in this story, aren't there? As we have noted, Joseph isn't completely innocent in all of this. He is bringing back this bad report, this faithless report, this slanderous report. Not just a factual telling of events, but a colored report that seems to be painting his brothers in the most negative way possible. Joseph at least bears some responsibility for the tattered relationship that he has with his brothers. There are often times where we are going to find ourselves in metaphorical pits in our lives, and we look around and try to blame everyone else in our lives and everyone who has even glanced into our lives, when in reality, sometimes the first person we need to be looking at and pointing the finger at is me. Adam tried to blame Eve. King Saul tried to blame all of the Israelites. But give King David credit when Nathan came to him and said, "You are the man." David fessed up. Sometimes we're in the pit because of our own bad choices. And that just may be life sometimes. We may have to lie in the bed that we've made, and it may be really uncomfortable. But as we'll see in just a moment, there's hope. Other times we are going to suffer because of the poor decisions of others. Joseph is thrown into the pit ultimately because who made the decision to do it? His brothers. And why did his brothers hate him? It wasn't singularly because of what Joseph had done, was it? Why did his brothers hate him? His brothers hated him because his father loved him, and his father loved him more than everybody else. And that just set the stage for ruin in a family, didn't it? Sometimes we're going to suffer because of the poor decisions of others. In this way, the brothers are not uniquely guilty. They are guilty, just as Joseph is guilty in some ways. But there is a lot of blame to go around here that extends not only to Joseph and not only to the brothers, it also goes to Jacob. And could I submit to you, it also goes to Isaac and Rebekah, and even as far back as Abraham and Sarah, which brings me to number 2. In the pit, we learned that the decisions that we make as parents set a tone for our families. You know what I imagine Joseph thought in the pit if he had an opportunity to? What if I just took that coat off? Now, that's the voice of a 17-year-old who's been through some life experience and who has now had the luxury of reevaluating his life at the bottom of a pit. Not too many of us at 17 are going to find ourselves in the pit and have the intellectual and emotional wherewithal to make these sort of judgments. But don't you think Joseph thought, you know what if I just said no to the coat? Now let's be clear, it shouldn't be up to a child to have to say no to the coat, right? Who should have said no to the coat? Jacob should have never given it to Joseph. Or if he does give it to Joseph, what should he have done? Given it to all his brothers and his sister too. But he didn't. But why didn't he? Why didn't Jacob give the coat to his brothers and his sisters? Or sister? What had Jacob seen growing up? Go back to Genesis chapter 25 and verse 28 for just a moment. Genesis 25 and verse 28. Genesis chapter 25, look down here with me at verse 28. Here are Isaac's sons, Jacob, who's going to be the father of Joseph, and Esau. And just very casually inserted here in chapter 25 and verse 28 is this verse by Moses, which says what? Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Is it any wonder why Jacob showed favoritism among his children? What had Jacob seen growing up in his own life when he was a child? Favoritism. That ends up driving a wedge between him and his brother for years, doesn't it? You ever wonder why Isaac showed that kind of favoritism towards his children? Remember back in Genesis chapter 21, in verse 19? God opened up her eyes. She saw a well of water, Hagar did, and she went and filled the skin with water, gave the lad a drink. God was with the lad. He grew up and lived in the wilderness. He lived in the wilderness of Paran. His mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt, describing the life here of Hagar and Ishmael. In verse 9 of chapter 21, Sarah, Abraham's wife, the mother of Isaac, saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking, and therefore she said to Abraham, drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. Never mind the fact, Sarah's the one who came up with the plan earlier to bring Ishmael into existence. But now she says, he is not my Isaac, get him out of here. He's not my child, even though she was perfectly content to have him be her child earlier. Do you see this long family history of favoritism and the accompanying ruin that follows it? Isaac learns it from his parents. Jacob learns it from Isaac. Joseph experiences it from Jacob, and we see the heartbreak that ensues from it. If we walk away with nothing else, walk away with this, our families are made better when we parents choose godliness earlier and sooner. We make a mistake if we decide we're going to wait until the teenage years, until the late teen years, until the 20s to really get serious about spirituality with our children and with our families. We need to choose godliness earlier. We need to choose godliness sooner. Hey, and it may be that we're in our teens and 20s, and this is all the time that we have, then we're going to choose now to start. But if, God willing, we are not in that position and we've got more time, we need to make the decision now, today, sooner, earlier, that godliness is going to be the priority. Because I'm a parent, that's my job to make that decision. I don't need to wait until my kids are the ones who are really expressing the interest in spiritual matters. I need to be the one cultivating that within them. I think about some of the things that my daughters really, really like. I used to brag that some of you will get this and some of you will be like that, but that's okay. My Bree, when she was younger, loved Tom T. Hall, Ray Stevens, and Catfish. Some of you get that, some of you don't. I was proud of that. But why did she love Catfish, Ray Stevens, and Tom T. Hall? Because that's what Daddy and her did. We listened to that music in my truck. We sang those songs together. We would eat catfish every now and then on a special occasion. We oohed and awed and made it such a big deal. We induced that, right? We planted that seed. We molded that. We know how to do that with Texas Tech baseball, and we know how to do that with Texas A&M football. We know how to do that with all sorts of different things. Can't we do that with spiritual things too? Can't we put in the effort and the work to do that? Our families will be blessed by us as parents choosing godliness earlier and choosing godliness sooner. Think about this. Point number 3. Sometimes my only choice is going to be survival. You're not crawling out of the pit, are you, if you're Joseph? Bones are broken. There's no ladder. You're stuck. And as I see it, you've got 2 choices as you're in the pit. Suicide or survive. That's it. And if we are intensely honest in the moment, when you hear someone talking about murdering you or selling you off into human slavery, could the thought of suicide possibly just linger on the horizon? And I'm not saying that that's the answer. I'm certainly not saying that's the answer. But is that a real thought that might pop into our heads? They have thrown 17-year-old Joseph down into the pit. He's not getting out of the pit because he's broken. He's got 2 options left before him. Kill himself or survive. And as sad and as heartrending as it may be, sometime in your life, sometime in my life, this might be where we are metaphorically. We might be in a metaphorical pit where we feel like the only options in front of us are just ending it all or just getting by to the next day and getting by to the next day. And let me tell you, if that's where you are, if that's the pit that you're in, do that. Just focus on getting to the next day. Focus on surviving to the next day. Because what eventually happens to Joseph? He gets out of the pit. There's hope. Remember all those blessings that God had revealed to him in a dream? All his brothers are going to bow down to him. The sun and moon, 11 stars are going to... That hadn't been fulfilled yet. There's still hope. And you and me, let's think of all the wonderful promises God has given us. Not the least of which is hope. Hope beyond this world. Eternal hope. Hope that does not and cannot disappoint if we simply focus our eyes on Jesus and follow him. It may be something like an unplanned pregnancy, and you're not married. And you may feel like, I've ruined my life, I've ruined my family. I'm better off if I killed myself. No, you're not. You're not. You may lose your job, feel like you're not doing anything for your family, feel like you're just a burden on your family. My family would just be better off if I killed myself. They won't be. And you won't be. But sometime your only choice might be, I need to make it till tomorrow. And if that's where you find yourself, that's what you do. You make it till tomorrow. And you trust in a God who has taken care of millions of people before you. That he'll make a way to take care of you too. And remember that taking your own life is never the answer. If I was Joseph, this would cross my mind in the pit. But aren't you glad Joseph didn't choose to take his own life? Number one, how much richer is the biblical narrative because of Joseph? If for nothing else, Genesis chapter 39, when he hightails it out of Potiphar's house, leaving his robe in the hand of Potiphar's wife. And Paul, picking up on that in the book of 1 Corinthians, is going to talk to us about doing what from sexual immorality? Fleeing sexual immorality. No doubt a hat tip to the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis, right? How much richer is the Bible because of the story of Joseph? How much richer in the Bible, is the Bible because of stories of men like Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah and Daniel being thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Did they know they were going to get delivered in the burning fiery furnace or the lion's den? No. They just said, we're going to follow God. And we're not going to turn our backs on him. And God delivered each and every one of them. Who's to say that when you get out of the pit, your life isn't going to be much more meaningful not only to you, but to others who are around you with the story you're able to tell and the guidance you're able to provide. Even more so in the story of Joseph, two passages and then we're done tonight. Look at Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7 provides an excellent summary of this entire Old Testament story. And so rather than me try to summarize the entire book of Genesis, let's just go to the book of Acts and look at 3 verses. Acts chapter 7, look at verse 11 with me. Acts chapter 7, Hechos capítulo 7, verso 11. Acts chapter 7 and verse 11. Joseph eventually, as we said, winds up in Potiphar's house. He's thrown into prison, works his way out of prison, all the way up to second in command in all of the land of Egypt. And in verse 11, the rest of the book of Genesis tells us a famine came over all Egypt and Canaan, and great affliction with it, and our fathers could find no food. But when Jacob, Joseph's father, heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our fathers there the first time. On the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family was disclosed to Pharaoh. And then Joseph sent word and invited Jacob and his brothers and all his relatives to come to him. 75 people in all. They're going to settle in the land of Goshen outside of Egypt. And that's where the Israelites, the people of Jacob, are going to be, avoiding the famine that was throughout the whole world. If Jacob doesn't get to the land of Goshen because of Joseph, what happens to his family? What happens to all the sons of Jacob except for Joseph? They die. Now look at Hebrews 7. Why would that be significant if all of Jacob's sons except for Joseph died? Why would that be significant? Look at Hebrews chapter 7 and verse 14. Where the Hebrew writer reminds us something about Jesus. Where he's talking about a greater context here about the law of Moses and about priesthood, he simply says this in verse 14, for it is evident that our Lord is descended from Judah, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning priesthood. We might think that Jesus descended from Joseph, all of the similarities in their life and the types and figures and things like that, but we'd be wrong. Jesus descended from whom? Judah. If Joseph doesn't save his brothers by relocating them to Egypt, all the sons of Jacob except for Joseph die. That includes Judah. There goes Judah. There goes the Messianic line. There goes Jesus. Aren't you glad Joseph didn't kill himself? Aren't you glad Joseph persevered? Aren't you glad you and I have hope because of the decisions that a 17-year-old made while he was in prison? And while he was in a pit? And while he was scared and alone? Hey, we're going to face hardship in our lives. We're going to face difficulty. We're going to face challenges. But it is all about how we respond to those challenges. And it's about the fact that we have a God that we can trust. A God who for thousands of years has taken care of his people. Even in spite of their sins, and has worked with them and helped them and molded them and made them into the people that he needs them to be. And if he's been able to do that for thousands and thousands of years and millions of people, don't you think he's still able to do it today? And isn't he still able to do it through his word? That's why we study. That's why we open our Bibles. That's why we look at stories like Joseph and Moses and folks like that. There are going to be times when we're in the pit. But for the child of God, the pit doesn't last forever. And one way or another, as a child of God, you come out of that pit, and you come out of that pit to a better place, in a better state. So if you're in the pit, it's not hopeless. You can make it. You've got a God who loves you, and you've got brothers and sisters who love you too and want to help get you out of that pit and want to help you in whatever way they can. If you've never come to God, if you've never come to him through his Son, Jesus Christ, washed in his blood for the forgiveness of your sins, raised to walk a new life in baptism, we offer you that opportunity this evening. Maybe as a Christian, you've been in the pit and you've been struggling and you haven't been focusing on God, you haven't been living as you should, and you want to change. We want to help you make that change. We want to pray with you and encourage you. If we can do anything for you tonight, would you let us know by coming while we stand?